Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into, well, one of the messiest, but maybe also one of the most foundational periods of ancient history.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about the long shadow of the Persian Empire stretching over Judah. Why is ancient history always so messy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think it's because we're dealing with these huge timescales,
Oh,
right?
yeah, vast amounts of time.
And fragmented records, empires rising and falling, and, crucially for today, generations of powerful kings who often shared the same name. Or maybe the same title.
Exactly. And when you look at this specific source we're using, this really detailed chronological chart, it covers almost 170 years.
It's a lot. From 597 BC right up to 424 BC.
And it immediately shows you this isn't just a simple A to B story.
Not at all. And our source, to its credit, starts right off by saying, look, scholars disagree, opinions differ wildly on some of this stuff, so getting absolute certainty is, well, difficult.
But that doesn't mean we can't find some clarity, right? That's our goal.
Precisely. The mission today isn't just, listing dates like a textbook.
No. We want to cut through that complexity, try to synthesize these estimated dates that the source gives us, and figure out why the precise sequence of these 4 different royal decrees, why they're so incredibly important.
Yeah, issued from Susa or Babylon, they're vital.
And it's not just for understanding the history, is it? It's about unlocking one of the most famous and probably most disputed prophetic timelines ever recorded.
Absolutely. And to help us do that, our source gives us this brilliant interpretive key right at the start, a crucial tip.
Okay, what is it?
It tells us that many of the royal names we run into, names like Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes, even Darius's, often they're not unique personal names like, Bob or Alice.
Ah, okay. So they function more like titles, official designations tied to the king's office.
Exactly. Kind of like how you might refer to every Roman emperor after the first one as Caesar, or every Egyptian ruler as Pharaoh. It's a title of the office.
That makes sense. Like maybe president or prime minister today.
Precisely. And if we try to rigidly say, okay, this biblical name always refers to this one specific Persian king, we just hit dead ends. Constant contradictions between Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, Esther.
Right, because the names pop up at different times.
Yeah. But if you see these terms as dynastic titles, these official names for the office of the King of Kings, it allows for the kind of chronological fluidity you actually see in the historical records themselves.
Oh, so?
Well, think about it. An inscription somewhere might use the king's birth name, right? But then a diplomatic letter might just call him Ahasuerus or Artaxerxes. It's the same guy, different context, different designation.
Okay, that immediately makes the task seem a bit less daunting. But doesn't it also create a risk? If we just assume it's a title, how do we know which historical king holds that title at any given moment? How does the source justify its choices?
That's the challenge. It forces us to rely really heavily on the context clues. What did this king do? Who did he conquer? Who was his father? What was his connection to, say, Cyrus the Great?
So actions speak louder than names in this case.
Pretty much. This distinction, name versus title, it's the absolute key to navigating this whole 170-year Persian timeline we're looking at. We have to focus on the events, the decrees, maybe more than the names themselves.
Got it. Okay, so let's start the clock then. Where does this whole timeline really begin? What's the initiating event?
The clock really starts ticking with the exile, the beginning of the end for Judah's independence.
Right. The Babylonian exile.
That takes us all the way back to 597 BC. That's the period of the initial major captivity. Our source pinpoints the start with Jehoiachin. You might also know him as Jeconiah.
Ah, the young king?
Yeah, a really tragic figure. His reign was incredibly brief. He was only 8 years old when he took the throne, apparently, and ruled Jerusalem for just 100 days.
100 days.
Yeah.
Barely enough time to get settled. It feels almost symbolic, like the practical end of the Davidic dynasty's real power.
It really was. And then the Babylonian juggernaut Nebuchadnezzar arrives on the scene.
And he doesn't mess around.
No. In 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar takes Jehoiachin captive, and crucially for what follows, he strips the temple. He takes its most valuable objects, the sacred vessels, and carts them off to Babylon.
So that's the foundational event. That action kicks off this whole period of desolation and servitude that the prophets talk about, the period we need to define later.
Exactly. That's the moment.
Now, what's fascinating, looking at our source, is how it immediately links this foundational exile event to figures who become absolutely central later on, but in the Persian court.
Yeah, it makes a direct connection. We're talking about Mordecai and Hadassah.
Hadassah, who most people know as Queen Esther.
That's her. Mordecai, the source identifies him as a Benjaminite, was taken captive during this initial wave back in 597 BC. It's very specific.
Okay, and Hadassah.
Hadassah was his younger cousin. He apparently raised her after her parents died. So they go into exile together, or at least around the same time, as part of that first major deportation.
Okay, now here's where, as you read the source, the timeline it presents gets, well, really unconventional compared to what you might typically hear about Esther.
It diverges significantly.
The source estimates Hadassah became queen roughly 10 years after this initial exile, so around 587 BC.
Yeah, do the math. 597 minus 10 is 587 BC.
But that places the whole story of Esther decades before the Persian Empire. Under Cyrus, even conquered Babylon. Babylon doesn't fall until 539 BC.
It's a huge chronological shift, you're right, and we absolutely have to tackle that head on. The, let's say, standard view usually places Esther under Xerxes I.
The Ahasuerus who fought the Greeks.
Exactly. Much later, maybe around 480 BC or so. But our source pulls her story way, way earlier, placing her under a different king who also held the title Ahasuerus.
Okay, but why? What's the logic? Why shift the Esther narrative forward by, 100 years? That's massive.
The logic presented in the source seems to be about fitting the narrative into the context of the Median kingdom, which existed before and alongside the early Persians.
Ah, the Medes and the Persians. Daniel mentioned them together.
Right. The source suggests that in this earlier period, around 587 BC, Hadassah became queen of the Medes. And the king she married, identified by the title Ahasuerus, was the father of Darius the Mede.
Darius the Mede. The one who takes over Babylon briefly in the book of Daniel.
Exactly. The one Daniel served under right after Belshazzar's fall. The source connects this Median Ahasuerus to Darius the Mede, who it says ruled briefly from 539 to 537 BC, essentially the last king of Media before Cyrus fully consolidated power.
So the argument is the Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, the one who divorced Vashti and married Esther, wasn't Xerxes the first of Persia, but an earlier Median king. And the story happened in the Median court before Persia took over completely.
That seems to be the interpretation presented here. It's a way to resolve having two prominent figures called Ahasuerus appearing maybe a century apart in different biblical contexts. It suggests the Ahasuerus in Esther was the father of Darius the Mede.
Okay, that's definitely an interpretive move. It sounds like it's designed to maybe solve some textual difficulties elsewhere, maybe in Daniel.
That could well be the motivation. It's important we flag this, though. This is a contested chronology. It's not the standard timeline you'll find in most history books, but it's the one our source uses to structure its argument.
Understood. So, sticking with this source's narrative then, we fast forward from that early exile and this early placement of Esther to the really pivotal moment, 539 BC. The fall of Babylon.
Right. And this is where Darius the Mede, the figure we just mentioned, supposedly Esther's stepson in this timeline, aged 62 according to Daniel, officially obtains the kingdom after Belshazzar is killed.
And the source makes a family connection to Cyrus the Great, doesn't it?
It does. It identifies Darius the Mede as Cyrus's maternal uncle and his father-in-law.
Wow, okay. That family tie is pretty significant. It suggests it wasn't just a hostile takeover, maybe more of a dynastic transition, ensuring some stability.
It absolutely implies that, a smoother transition. And that connection leads us directly to the main man, Cyrus the Great. He reigns, according to this chart, from 537 to 530 BC. And he is identified here as Darius the Mede's son-in-law.
Okay, so Cyrus takes the reins, and he's the one who issues the first really big landscape-changing decree.
Decree number 1. Issued, the source states it, in 537 BC. And yeah, this command changed everything for the exiles.
What was it specifically?
It was the command for the return of the captives and, crucially, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem.
The green light, go home, rebuild the center of your worship.
Exactly. Now, pause here for a second. Think about the timing. This decree comes in 537 BC. Mordecai, remember, was taken captive in 597 BC.
Okay, 597 minus 537, that's 60 years. Exactly 60 years.
Precisely. And our source directly links this 537 DC decree to fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy, the prophecy that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years.
Wait a minute. If the exile started from Mordecai in 597, and the decree is 60 years later in 537, but Jeremiah prophesied 70 years, where'd the other 10 years go?
You've just hit the nail on the head. That apparent 10-year gap, the 60 versus 70, that's the source of the whole prophetic headache we absolutely need to unpack next.
Okay, so this forces us right into the thick of the debate about how to calculate Jeremiah's 70 years.
Exactly. Section 3. defining that crucial 70-year window.
All right, let's get granular on this. The 70 years of desolation. Jeremiah prophesied it, Daniel understood it while he was in exile, but how you count it, the start and end points, that's where everyone disagrees. What are the main viewpoints our source looks at?
Okay, the source basically lays out two primary ways people try to calculate it, viewpoint A and viewpoint B. The core issue boils down to this. Are the 70 years measuring the time the temple building was physically gone or destroyed? Or are they measuring the duration of the Jewish people's captivity and servitude to Babylon?
Physical structure versus political condition. Okay,
Yeah.
let's take viewpoint A first, the one the source rejects. This one tries to link the 70 years to the temple building itself.
Right. Viewpoint A says the clock starts when the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. The source dates this destruction to 588 BC.
Okay, 588 BC. And the endpoint for this view.
The endpoint would be when the Second Temple was completed and dedicated. That happened, according to the source and historical consensus, in 516 BC.
All right, let's do the math again. 588 BC down to 516 BC. 588 minus 516. That's 72 years.
Exactly, 72 years.
So if you're looking for a super literal, day-perfect fulfillment of a 70-year prophecy, 72 years is instantly a problem, isn't it? It's close, sure. But 2 years off seems significant if you're expecting precision.
It does. And that's precisely why our source explicitly says, look, the 70 years is not defined by temple destruction to temple rebuilding. That physical rebuilding process took 72 years, but the prophecy specifically said 70. So viewpoint A doesn't quite fit the bill.
Okay, so viewpoint A is out, according to this analysis. That brings us to viewpoint B, the one the source prefers. How does this one work?
Viewpoint B shifts the focus. It argues the 70 years represent the duration the Israelites were actually held captive by Babylon. It's about the period of captivity to freedom.
So it's focused on the people's political status, their servitude, not the stones of the temple.
Exactly. The period is defined by the time frame from the very first captivity under Babylon all the way to the Cyrus decree that granted their release.
Okay, now this is where the 60 years we calculated earlier comes back in, right? From Jehoiachin's exile in 597 BC to Cyrus's decree in 537 BC. That was 60 years. How does viewpoint B bridge that gap to get to 70?
It does it by pushing the start date earlier. It argues that the servitude didn't begin with Jehoiachin in 597 BC. That was a major deportation, yes, but it wasn't the absolute beginning of Babylonian dominance.
Okay, so when did the servitude begin, according to this view?
The source traces it back to what's often called the first captivity. This happened earlier, around 607 or 606 BC. This was when Nebuchadnezzar first marched on Judah, began subjugating the kingdom, and took initial hostages, including, most famously, Daniel and his companions.
I see. So 597 BC, Jehoiachin's exile, was actually the second major wave, or maybe even the third, depending on how you count minor deportations. But the clock really started ticking around 607 or 606 BC.
That's the argument. You shift the starting line back about 10 years, and our source actually gives two slightly different calculations for this preferred viewpoint B, both arriving at 70 years.
Okay, what's the first calculation?
The first one uses the start date of 607 BC for that first captivity, and it counts down to the Cyrus decree date of 537 BC.
Okay, 607 minus 537, that's exactly 70 years. Perfect fit.
Yep. 70 years on the nose.
What's the second variation then?
The second one uses a slightly different start date, 606 BC, for that initial subjugation. And it calculates the endpoint not just to Cyrus's decree itself, 537 BC, but to the year after the decree when the returning exiles actually laid the foundation of the new temple. That was in 536 BC.
Okay, so 606 BC down to 536 BC. That also lands exactly at 70 years.
70 years again.
Interesting. So both calculations work out perfectly to 70. The slight difference seems to hinge on whether you date the start to 607 or 606 and the end to the decree itself or the immediate action taken upon it. Why the wiggle room of a year there?
Well, that really highlights the difficulty our source openly acknowledges. We're looking back thousands of years. Was it definitely 606 BC or 605 BC when Judah completely lost its autonomy? Ancient records weren't always kept with the kind of unified calendar precision we expect today.
Right. Things like, did they count the first year of a king's reign starting immediately or only from the next new year? Accession year versus non-accession year dating.
Exactly. Those kinds of technical details, which varied between cultures and time periods, can easily throw off a calculation by a year or two when you're trying to align different chronologies over centuries. It's incredibly complex.
So, accepting that slight imprecision in the exact year, why does focusing on the concept of captivity ending, viewpoint B, provide a stronger fulfillment of the 70 years than focusing on temple rebuild, viewpoint A?
Because, the argument goes, Jeremiah's prophecy was fundamentally about the status of the people and the land under God's judgment. The 70 years were prophesied as years of servitude to the king of Babylon.
Right, a period of punishment and humbling.
So the event that marks the beginning of that servitude, the first captivity, around 607, 606 BC, and the event that marks the end of that servitude, Cyrus's decree of release in 537, 536 BC, those define the actual duration of their national humbling and bondage.
That makes sense. It's a much more robust narrative arc, focusing on the nation's condition rather than getting hung up on the 2-year discrepancy involved in, finishing the physical construction of a building.
Exactly. It prioritizes the spiritual and political reality of the Israelites over just the architectural timeline. The reliable core, the source is suggesting, is the event, the start and end of the bondage itself.
That's a really crucial distinction. Okay, so we're focusing on the events. And the first major event after the exile begins is Cyrus's decree allowing the return.
Right. Cyrus reigns until about 530 BC, according to the chart. His decree was 537 BC, and the foundation of the new temple was laid the next year, 536 BC.
And that moment, laying the foundation,
Yeah.
that's described so vividly in the book of Ezra, isn't it? With really mixed emotions.
Oh, it's a stunning scene. You have the older generation, people who actually remembered Solomon's temple before its destruction. They're weeping aloud, weeping because presumably this new foundation seemed so much smaller, so much less glorious than the memory of the first one.
Weight of loss, yeah.
But then you have the younger generation, those born in exile or too young to remember the first temple. They're shouting for joy. It's this incredible juxtaposition of profound loss and grief right alongside burgeoning hope and celebration, a really powerful human moment.
But that hope, that momentum, it didn't last very long, did it? The work gets stopped.
No, it hit a major roadblock pretty quickly. After Cyrus dies, his son, Cambyses, takes the throne. He reigned from 530 to 522 BC.
And that change in leadership was an opportunity for opponents.
Exactly. The enemies of the Jews living in the surrounding regions, Samaritans and others, they immediately saw their chance. They likely wrote letters to the new king, Cambyses, stirring up trouble.
What kind of trouble? What did they accuse the Jews of?
Oh, the usual stuff. Sowing sedition, planning rebellion. They probably argued that letting the Jews rebuild Jerusalem, especially its defenses, would create a strong, independent base that could challenge Persian authority in a really strategic region. Remember, Judah is right there on the land bridge between Mesopotamia and Egypt.
Always a sensitive area for empires.
Always. So Cambyses, likely influenced by these reports and maybe exercising political caution, he issues a command. The source calls it the Decree of Suspension. It effectively forbade the continuation of the temple construction.
Wow. So after maybe only 6 years of excitement, a foundation laid. The whole project just grinds to a halt. That must have been absolutely crushing for the returnees.
Devastating. Imagine the psychological blow. And the work stopped completely. That foundation just sat there, exposed and unfinished for years.
How many years are we talking?
Well, Cambyses reigned until 522 BC. The work remained stopped until the reign of the next major Persian king.
Okay, so the project is stalled. It's in limbo until we get to the next key player on our chart, the second Darius.
Right. This is the second Darius. Historically, he's Darius I, often called Darius the Great, or Darius Staspes. He reigned for a long time, 521 to 486 BC.
And how does the source connect him to the previous rulers?
It identifies him as Cyrus's son-in-law. This connection helps legitimize his claim to the throne, especially after the somewhat chaotic period following Cambyses' death. There was actually a usurper for a short time before Darius solidified his power.
So Darius I comes to power around 521 BC.
Yeah.
And things change for the temple project.
Yes, big time. There seems to have been a major internal push happening simultaneously. You have the prophets Haggai and Zechariah active in Jerusalem at this exact time, powerfully urging the governors, Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua and all the people to get back to work on the temple. They basically said, how can you live in your nice houses while God's house lies in ruins?
Prophetic pressure from within, meeting a potentially more favorable king in Persia.
Exactly. And Darius responds. In his second year on the throne, which the source states as 520 BC, Darius issues decree number 2.
And this decree?
This was the command to resume temple construction. It effectively broke the suspension that Cambyses had put in place.
Was it a completely new initiative from Darius? Or was he building on Cyrus's original plan?
That's a key point. It wasn't really a new decree and concept. What happened was the local governor, Tatnai, questioned the renewed building activity. So Darius ordered a search of the royal archives. They actually found Cyrus's original scroll, the first decree, filed away in Ecbatana.
Wow, they found the paperwork.
Ah, yes.
Huh.
Ancient bureaucracy saved the day. So Darius wasn't just starting something new. He was investigating, finding the precedent, and then commanding that his predecessor, Cyrus's original decree, be enforced. He even ordered the local governors to help the Jews and provide resources from the royal treasury.
So Decree 2 is really about reauthorizing and enforcing Decree 1.
Precisely. And this time, with strong royal backing and prophetic encouragement, the work got finished.
Finally, bringing that 72-year period of the temple being physically absent to a close.
Yep. It took another 4 years of construction. In Darius' 6th year on the throne, 516 BC, the Second Temple was completed and dedicated.
And as we noted earlier, if you measure from the destruction in 588 BC to this completion in 516 BC, that's exactly 72 years. Fits viewpoint A's timeline, even though the source prefers viewpoint B for the 70 years of prophecy.
Correct. And the dedication itself was a major event. Sacrifices were offered, and they celebrated the Passover in the newly completed temple. It signified the restoration, at least, of the core religious center of Jewish life.
Okay, so we've had 2 successful temple decrees. Cyrus starts it, Decree I. Darius restarts and finishes it, Decree I. Now we move forward in time, past Darius' long reign, to one of the most, well, famously confusing figures in the whole Persian timeline.
Ah, yes, King Ahasuerus.
The name instantly brings the Book of Esther to mind for most people.
It does. Now, the king reigning after Darius I was his son, Xerxes I. He reigned from 486 to 464 BC. Our source is very clear in identifying him. The Hebrew name is Ahasuerus. The Old Persian name is Kshairusha.
And this is the Xerxes famous for the massive invasion of Greece, right? The battles of Thermopylae, Salamis.
That's the one. Immensely powerful, ruled a vast empire, but ultimately faced setbacks against the Greeks. He's the son of Darius I, and therefore the grandson of Cyrus the Great through his mother, Atassa.
Okay. And he's also the king most often identified with Ahasuerus in the Book of Esther, in the conventional timeline, which brings us right back to that chronological controversy we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Our source explicitly notes this common claim that Xerxes I married Hadassah Esther. But the author of our source disputes this. It says it is not likely that the Ahasuerus mentioned in the Book of Esther is this particular king, Xerxes I.
So the source is doubling down on its earlier interpretation. It's using that interpretive key. Ahasuerus is a title to say, yes, Xerxes, I held the title Ahasuerus from 486-464 BC. But the specific Ahasuerus who married Esther was a different earlier ruler, likely a Median king before Cyrus, who also held that title.
That appears to be the argument. It requires separating the title Ahasuerus from the historical person Xerxes, or when reading the Book of Esther, according to this source's timeline.
Okay. It's crucial we keep track of that interpretation, as it differs from many standard views. If we follow the source's logic, the Esther story already happened, providing context for Jewish influence before these next big decrees. If we follow the standard view, Esther would be queen right around now, maybe 480 BC, in the middle of Xerxes' reign.
Right. The source itself, wrestling with the identity of Ahasuerus, just proves how vital that title versus name distinction is for navigating these texts. Either way you slice it, though, Xerxes reigns for over 20 years, and his reign bridges the gap to the next king, the one who issued the decrees that shift the focus entirely.
The decrees that really matter for the city itself, not just the temple.
Exactly. Which brings us to Artaxerxes I.
Artaxerxes I, reigning, according to the chart, from 464 to 424 BC.
That's him. He had the nickname Longimanus.
Longimanus, what does that mean?
It means long arm or long-handed. There are ancient accounts, like from Plutarch, suggesting his right arm was noticeably longer than his left. Whether that's literally true or not, it was his moniker.
Huh. Okay. And he's identified as the son of the previous king.
Yes, son of Ahasuerus Xerxes I, and Artaxerxes I is responsible for the 2 absolutely critical decrees that changed the game. They shift the focus fundamentally away from just the temple structure.
Okay, so we're moving beyond the sanctuary itself. What's the new focus?
The focus shifts to the city of Jerusalem, its governance, its law, its people, and eventually its security.
All right, let's start with decree number 3. This one is associated with Ezra. When was it issued?
Decree was issued in Artaxerxes' 7th year. The source dates this to 458 BC. Think about that timeline. This is 130 years after the original temple was destroyed back in 588 BC. A long time.
130 years, wow. So what did this decree actually authorize?
It was revolutionary. First, it initiated a 3rd wave of returning exiles. This group was led by Ezra, who was both a priest and a scribe, an expert in the law of Moses.
Who came back with Ezra? Was it just priests?
No, it was a really comprehensive group indicating a desire to fully reestablish the community's structure. It included priests, Levites who assisted the priests, singers for the temple worship, gatekeepers for the temple complex, and also the Nethinim.
Nethinim. Remind us who they were again.
The Nethinim were essentially temple servants. They weren't Levites, but they were dedicated to performing the more menial but necessary tasks around the temple, things like fetching wood and water, general upkeep. Their inclusion shows this wasn't just about the elite returning, it was about rebuilding the entire support system needed for the temple and the community life around it.
Okay, so a large group returns under Ezra in 458 BC.
Mm-hmm.
But what made Artaxerxes' decree number 3, so fundamentally important? You said it shifted the focus beyond the temple building.
Yes. It wasn't just permission to return, it was the granting of significant legal and governmental authority to Ezra and the Jewish community.
How so? What specific powers did it grant?
Well, first, Artaxerxes provided really generous support for the temple services: silver, gold, animals for sacrifice, wheat, wine, oil, salt. He basically bankrolled the resumption of full-scale worship. But the truly significant parts were 2 major provisions that went far beyond the temple structure.
Okay, provision 1.
Provision 1 was a tax exemption. Artaxerxes decreed that all personnel working at the temple, priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, Nethinim, all of them were exempt from imperial taxes, tribute, custom, and toll.
That's huge. Why grant them tax exemption?
It's a massive political and economic statement. It ensures the religious leadership and the temple functions could operate without being crippled by imperial taxes. It basically underwrote their financial stability and independence, showing major royal favor.
Okay, that's significant. What was provision 2? This sounds like the really crucial one for governance.
It is. This is the core argument for why many see 458 BC as the true starting point for the restoration of Jerusalem as a functioning entity. Artaxerxes specifically empowered Ezra to appoint judges and magistrates throughout the entire province beyond the river, meaning Syria and Palestine.
Appoint judges. Based on what law?
Based on God's law, the law of Moses, Ezra was explicitly commissioned to govern the region according to Jewish law, and this is critical to teach the law to anyone who didn't know it.
Wow. So Artaxerxes is essentially delegating judicial power and educational authority for the Jewish population back to them, based on their own religious law.
Exactly. And he backed it up with serious enforcement power. The decree stated that anyone who disobeyed either the king's law or the law of God was subject to severe penalties: death, banishment, confiscation of property, or imprisonment.
So the Persian state was putting its muscle behind the enforcement of Jewish law within the Jewish community.
That's what the decree implies. It effectively elevated Jerusalem and the surrounding Jewish territory from just being a place with a rebuilt temple to being a recognized civil and judicial entity operating under its own divine law, with the full backing and authority of the Persian king. This, for many, is the true restoration of the state of Jerusalem.
And we see the impact of this almost immediately in the book of Ezra, don't we? With the issue of intermarriage.
Yes, precisely. Soon after arriving, Ezra confronts the issue of Jewish men having married foreign women from the surrounding nations, which was against the law. He leads the people in repentance, and they make a covenant to separate from these foreign wives. That whole episode demonstrates the profound impact of this renewed legal and religious authority stemming directly from Artaxerxes' decree on the actual life of the community.
Okay, so Decree 3 in 458 BC establishes legal and governmental restoration. But there was still something missing, wasn't there? Something pretty fundamental for any city, especially an ancient capital.
There was. 13 years later, despite having the law reestablished and judges appointed, the city of Jerusalem itself was still physically vulnerable. It lacked walls. It was basically an open city, defenseless against potential enemies.
And that leads us to Decree number 4.
Exactly. Decree Om, issued in Artaxerxes' 20th year on the throne, the source dates this to 445 BC.
445 BC, that's 143 years after the temple destruction. And this decree is associated with Nehemiah.
Right. This is the famous story of Nehemiah. He was a high-ranking official in the Persian court, serving as King Artaxerxes' cupbearer in Susa.
A position of great trust.
Immense trust. And he receives word from visitors from Judah that Jerusalem is still in a terrible state. The walls are broken down, the gates burned with fire, and the returned exiles are living in great trouble and shame.
And this news devastates him.
It does. He weeps, mourns, fasts, and prays. And then he takes a huge risk and approaches King Artaxerxes. He requests permission to go to Judah, specifically to the city of my ancestors' tombs, meaning Jerusalem, so that he can rebuild it.
His focus is explicitly on the physical structure of the defenses.
Entirely. It's about restoring the city's physical integrity, its security, and removing the shame of its ruined state. And amazingly, King Artaxerxes grants his request. The king's response was, again, incredibly supportive.
So what were the specific provisions in Decree 4, the Nehemiah Decree, that makes some scholars argue this is the definitive command to rebuild the city?
Well, like with Ezra, Artaxerxes provided official letters. Nehemiah got letters for safe passage, addressed to the governors of the provinces he'd travel through, ensuring they wouldn't hinder him. That was standard practice.
But the crucial part.
The crucial part was a specific command addressed to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. Artaxerxes ordered Asaph to provide Nehemiah with timber.
Timber for what, specifically?
The decree, as recorded in Nehemiah, specifies timber for three things. 1, the gates of the citadel or fortress by the temple, the Bira. 2, the city wall itself. 3, and the house that Nehemiah would live in while overseeing the work.
The moment the king explicitly orders the release of materials for the gates and the wall, that feels like a very direct official sanction for physical military fortification.
Exactly, that's the argument. This goes beyond just establishing law or allowing people to live there. This is the king actively providing the resources needed to make Jerusalem defensible, to restore its status as a proper fortified city. It gives the city political and defensive teeth in a way that Ezra's earlier commission didn't, focused as it was on law and governance.
Okay, so these two Artaxerxes decrees are really the heart of the matter for the later prophetic interpretation, aren't they? Decree the third in 458 BC, focusing on law and governance via Ezra, and Decree the fourth in 445 BC, focusing on walls and security via Nehemiah.
They form the absolute crux of our deep dive. They represent the two potential moments that shift the focus definitively to the reestablishment of Jerusalem as a functioning capital city in two different aspects.
Right. So we have our 4 key decrees laid out. 1, Cyrus, 537 BC, starts the temple. 2, Darius I, 520 BC, resumes and finishes the temple. 3, Artaxerxes I, year 7, 458 BC, establishes law, governance, judiciary, Ezra. 4, Artaxerxes I, year 20, 445 BC, commands walls and security, Nehemiah.
That's the sequence according to our source.
And now, we have to pivot to the core debate. How do these 4 events, especially the last 2, potentially unlock one of the most famous, most complex prophecies in the entire Bible?
The 70 weeks of Daniel.
Exactly. This is where everything we've discussed converges. The source defines the starting point of this prophecy, the 77s, as it's sometimes called as the Jerusalem Restoration Decree. The Hebrew term used in the source is Yerushalayim Jingenaram.
Right. And this prophecy, found in Daniel chapter 9, lays out this incredibly detailed timeline. It's understood to predict events leading up to and including the arrival of the Messiah, the Anointed One. And it defines this timeline using 70 periods of 7 years.
Okay, let's just briefly touch on the mechanics here because it can get complicated.
Right.
77, so 70 times 7, that's 490 years total, right?
490 years is the total span. But there's a common interpretation which our source seems to implicitly accept that these might be prophetic years.
Prophetic years, meaning not necessarily 365-day solar years.
Correct. A prophetic year is often interpreted as being 360 days long, possibly based on some ancient calendar systems or interpretations of other prophecies. If you take that view, then 490 prophetic years would equal 176,400 days.
Okay, 176,400 days. If you convert that into our modern 365.24 days solar years, what does that come out to?
It comes out to approximately 483 solar years. Now, the prophecy itself breaks down the 490 years or 483 solar years into segments. It speaks of 7 weeks, which would be 49 years, and 62 weeks, which would be 434 years, leading up to the Messiah. That first block totals 69 weeks.
69 weeks, so 483 years, whether prophetic or solar, depending on interpretation. And this period is supposed to run from the issuing of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the arrival of the Messiah Prince.
Exactly. So the absolute linchpin for understanding this prophecy is figuring out which of the decrees we've discussed is that command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. We need the definitive start date for that 483-year countdown.
And the crucial interpretive move, as we established earlier and as the source emphasizes, is making a clear distinction between rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the city.
It is absolutely essential. The source argues very strongly that the restoration decree needed to start the 70 weeks countdown must be a command related to the city itself, the urban area, its governance, its structure, its security, not just the temple building.
Why is that distinction so critical?
Because the temple was already finished. Darius's decree decree led to its completion way back in 516 BC. If the prophecy was just about the temple, the countdown would have started much earlier or perhaps ended then. But the prophecy specifies the restoration of Jerusalem.
Okay, so that immediately rules out Decree Hyrus and Decree R and Darius I as the starting point for the 70 weeks, doesn't it? They were primarily, if not exclusively, focused on the temple architecture.
Correct. The source explicitly argues that Decree R, which just resumed the previously halted temple work, is definitely not suitable as the starting point for the prophecy about rebuilding the city.
Which leads us exactly where we landed a few minutes ago, with the 2 decrees of Artaxerxes I.
Precisely. The starting point must be either Decree R, issued in Artaxerxes' 7th year, 458 BC, associated with Ezra, law, and governance. Decree R, issued in Artaxerxes' 20th year, 445 BC, associated with Nehemiah, the walls, and security. Both of these decrees deal with the city and its functioning, not just the temple, but they address very different aspects of the city's restoration.
And this is it, the absolute crux of the deep dive. We have a 13-year difference between these 2 potential starting points, 458 BC versus 445 BC. And choosing one over the other completely shifts the calculated endpoint of that 483-year prophetic timeline.
13 years is a significant shift when you're trying to align it with historical events centuries later, like the life of Christ.
Okay, so why do scholars, and presumably our source, lean towards one or the other? Let's take the argument for Decree the Third, the 458 BC decree with Ezra. Why choose that one?
The argument for 458 BC centers on the idea that the true restoration of a city, especially a capital city like Jerusalem, is primarily about the restoration of its government, its legal system, and its societal structure.
The argument being, before you can even have a secure physical city, you need a functioning political and legal entity.
Exactly. Ezra's commission was incredibly comprehensive on this front. It wasn't just about bringing people back. It gave the Jewish community its own legal code, the Law of Moses, its own judiciary, the power to appoint judges and magistrates, and even its own state-sponsored educational system, the command to teach the law.
So a city is defined more by its citizens living under its own laws and jurisdiction, rather than just by its defensive perimeter.
That's the core idea. The Artaxerxes decree of 458 BC essentially reconstituted Jerusalem as a distinct legal jurisdiction within the Persian Empire, empowered to enforce its own native laws with Persian backing. For those who favor the state, this is the true commencement of the restoration spoken of by Daniel. It restored the polity of Jerusalem.
Okay, that's a strong case for 458 BC, focusing on the internal legal restoration. But then you have the other side, presumably making an equally strong case for Decree 4th, the 445 BC decree with Nehemiah. This one feels maybe more intuitively obvious. Rebuilding the city usually makes you think of walls and buildings.
It does seem more concrete, doesn't it? And the argument for 445 BC is straightforward. No city, especially in the ancient world, could truly be considered restored or function as a proper capital if it was left wide open and defenseless against its enemies.
A city without walls was barely a city at all, in terms of security and status.
Precisely. The building of the wall under Nehemiah was the definitive act of reestablishing Jerusalem's physical security and, to a degree, its political autonomy. Historically, a city's status, its safety, its ability to project power, or even just exist peacefully, was directly tied to the integrity of its walls and gates. Nehemiah's commission provided the actual materials and the explicit royal sanction for that physical military fortification.
So the debate boils down to this. Is the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem fulfilled when its internal authority and legal system are reestablished? Law focus, Ezra 458 BC. Or is it fulfilled only when its external defense and physical structure are secured? Walls focus, Nehemiah 445 BC.
That is the fundamental question that carries the entire weight of the prophetic interpretation. Both decrees seem necessary, in a sense, for a fully restored capital. But the prophecy seems to point to a single starting point, a single command.
And depending on which command you choose.
If you start the 483-year countdown from Ezra's decree in 458 BC, the calculation lands the end of those 69 weeks at one particular point in the 1st century AD, often linked to the time of Jesus' ministry or baptism.
Okay, but if you start 13 years later...
If you start the countdown with Nehemiah's decree in 445 BC, that entire 483-year timeline shifts forward by 13 years. This lands the prophetic endpoint significantly later in the 1st century AD, often aligning more closely with the traditional timing of Jesus' crucifixion.
So that 13-year difference is critical for how you map the prophecy onto the historical timeline of Jesus.
Absolutely critical.
And just to make things even more complicated, This choice between 458 BC and 445 BC isn't the only uncertainty, is it? You mentioned earlier the difficulty in dating the Persian kings themselves with absolute precision.
Exactly. Here's where that initial caution about the messiness of ancient history comes right back to bite us. The scholarly dating for when Artaxerxes I actually began his reign isn't universally fixed down to the exact year.
Oh, really? How much variation are we talking about?
Well, depending on which ancient historian you follow, how you interpret astronomical records, or whether you accept theories about co-regencies where he might have ruled alongside his father Xerxes for a time, the calculated date for Artaxerxes' first year can vary. Some scholars might place it a bit earlier, some a bit later. There can be a range of maybe not 10 years as the source suggested as a possibility, but certainly a few years of scholarly debate around the precise accession date.
So, if the king's first year is debated, then his 7th year for Decree III and his 20th year for Decree IV also become slightly fuzzy, don't they?
They do. A potential variation of even a couple of years in the starting point, 458 versus 457 BC or 445 versus 444 BC, can make a difference when you're projecting 483 years into the future.
Okay, so we have 1, uncertainty over which decree, 458 or 445, are the correct trigger. 2, uncertainty over the exact BC year for even those benchmark decrees due to debates about Artaxerxes' accession. 3, and then presumably there's also some scholarly debate about the exact dates for events in Christ's life at the other end of the timeline.
Precisely. The exact year of Jesus' birth, his baptism, the start of his public ministry, and his crucifixion, while generally placed in the early 1st century AD, are also subject to scholarly discussion, often varying by a few years based on how different gospel accounts and historical data are interpreted.
Wow, okay. So if you have a potential multi-year fuzziness at the starting point, the decree date, and a potential multi-year fuzziness at the proposed endpoint, events in Christ's life, trying to get a perfect calendar day alignment for the 483 years seems, well, almost impossible.
Using our modern calendar systems projected backwards, achieving that kind of pinpoint accuracy becomes incredibly challenging, maybe even futile. And that's the powerful takeaway that our source seems to be offering here, amidst all this complexity.
What's the takeaway then? Give up.
Not give up, but perhaps shift the focus. The source seems to emphasize that while the precise dates might be elusive or debated after millennia, the events themselves are clear. The sequence is clear.
The 4 decrees happened. They had distinct purposes.
Right. Decree 1, temple start. Decree 2, temple resume. Decree 3, city law governance established. Decree 4, city wall security rebuild. Those events and their distinct characters define the historical reality of the post-exilic period.
So, the source suggests maybe we should focus more on the nature and purpose of the decrees, especially the Artaxerxes ones, rather than getting bogged down in chasing an exact BC date that might be impossible to prove definitively.
That seems to be the most robust approach. It's a call for a certain kind of historical and interpretive humility.
Yeah.
We have to accept that we can understand the narrative arc, the significance of the events, and the potential prophetic connections without necessarily being able to nail the exact start and end dates down to the day or month on our modern calendar.
Okay, that feels like a sensible way to navigate this. We've managed to journey all the way from that brief 100-day reign of poor Jehoiachin back in 597 BC through the source's unconventional placement of Esther, tackled the whole 70-year servitude calculation, followed the temple rebuilding under Cyrus and Darius, and landed squarely on these 2 pivotal Artaxerxes commands for the city itself.
And hopefully, we successfully use those interpretive keys the source gave us. Treating names like Idarius, Ahasuerus, and Artaxerxes as potential titles really helped make sense of the different figures appearing across the timeline.
It did. It allowed us to process the potentially conflicting narratives without getting stuck.
And we also locked down that key knowledge nugget about the 70 years of desolation, which is so often misunderstood.
Right. Let's recap that clearly for everyone listening. According to this source's preferred view, the 70-year captivity period prophesied by Jeremiah is best defined by the duration of the bondage or servitude, running from the first exile around BC 607 or 606, down to the Cyrus decree granting freedom in BC 537 or 536.
Not crucially by the time the temple building was physically absent, which was 72 years from destruction in 588 BC to completion in 516 BC.
Defining it by the period of enslavement makes the prophecy directly relevant to the people's political and spiritual condition, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And directly sets up the need for the kind of restoration decrees we saw later.
Exactly. It frames the entire narrative.
Well, this has certainly been a deep dive into a really tangled knot of history where imperial decrees, ancient timelines, and profound prophecy all intersect. and it largely hinges on making a careful distinction between two specific decrees, issued just 13 years apart by the same Persian king.
It really highlights how much can turn on careful reading and interpretation, because the power of a restored capital city fundamentally rests on two pillars, doesn't it?
Which are?
Its ability to govern itself according to its own laws, and its ability to defend itself from external threats.
Law and walls, Ezra and Nehemiah, decree the third and decree the fourth.
The two sides of the coin for a functioning capital.
So let's leave you, the listener, with this final thought to mull over. Something to chew on as you process this complex chronology we've laid out. If the starting point of Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy hinges entirely on whether decree, Ezra's commission for law and governance in 458 BC, or decree D, Nehemiah's commission for the wall and physical construction in 445 BC, constitutes that definitive command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. How does the specific nature of the command you choose, focusing on law enforcement versus focusing on physical construction, how does that choice actually inform your fundamental definition of what makes a capital city truly restored?
That's a great question. Is a capital city functionally rebuilt when its laws are reestablished, its courts are functioning, and its society has a legal basis for existence, even if its walls are down? That's the 458 BC view.
Or is it only truly restored when its defenses are physically secure, when it's safe from its neighbors and can stand as a distinct political entity on the map? That's the 445 BC view.
The answer you lean towards fundamentally shapes how you see the subsequent 483 years of the prophecy unfolding. So think about it. What truly defines a city? What marks the beginning of its genuine restoration after ruin? Is it the invisible structures of law and society, or the visible structures of walls and gates?
A lot to think about there.